Barvasa, who is a Dominican friar at Blackfriars teaching. What are you teaching at the moment?
Systematic theology.
Systematic theology at Blackfriars. And he's talking about Meister Eckhart, mystic, of course, who lived, well, he'll say more. He knows a great deal more than I do. But the subtitle of the talk is The Birth of the Soul, something I'm sure all of us want to know about. So without any further hesitation, welcome.
Thank you very much. I first would like to apologize for my accent. I lived 5 years in Rome, and that really ruins your pronunciation, so sorry for that. The title is Meister Eckhart, The Birth of God in the Soul. And nearly 50 years ago, the German theologian Karl Rahner wrote in an essay on Christian piety, "It has been pointed out that the Christian of the future will be a mystic, or he will not exist at all. If by mysticism we mean that not a singular parapsychological phenomena, but a genuine experience of God emerging from the very heart of our existence, this statement is very true, and its truth and importance will become still clearer in the spirituality of the future." So far, Karl Rahner. The future of Christian faith, of Christian spirituality, according to Karl Rahner, is mysticism. And we can assume that the future of which Rahner spoke in 1966 is our contemporary reality today. In one respect, Rahner was definitely right, because mysticism is one of the great issues in our days. In some churches we find so-called mystical nights. The number of books written on this subject are countless, and even the new popularity of the old traditional liturgy in the Catholic Church is quite often due to its mystical character, with its rituals, the Latin language, and the Gregorian chants. But on the other hand, it seems to me that the term mysticism is rather unclarified, an obscure concept. The Flemish Dominican Edward Strillebeeks once distinguished between two different types of mysticism. The first one is the idea of mysticism as a specific field of supernatural phenomena, like visions, ecstasies, levitations, raptures, and so on. Mystical experiences are in this case exceptional and supernatural experiences of the divine, which might, for instance, result in a private revelation of God's will to specially gifted believers. On the other hand, the second meaning of mysticism would be an intensive experience of Christian faith itself, as the expression of our normal life as believers, without any supernatural phenomenon, like in the first case. Strillebeeks calls this kind of mysticism Dominican. But it seems to me that even a Jesuit like Rahner has this kind of mysticism on his mind when he talks about the Christian of the future as mystic. Mysticism in this sense is not something outside our normal Christian life, something only possible for mystical specialists, mystical professionals. But, as the theologian Dietmar Mead once said, the deep and intensive experience of Jesus Christ in our life, which leads us to a deeper and more profound understanding of our own identity in the mystery of faith. This short definition of mysticism is important when we talk about the probably most famous and most important mystic in the Christian Middle Ages and far beyond, the Dominican friar Meister Eckhart. Because in his life and his writings, we find nothing about supernatural experiences, like the ones we have in the first definition of mysticism. No visions, no private revelations, no ecstasies, no raptures, nothing like this can be found in the work of Eckhart. For many people, Eckhart is such an untypical mystic when you compare him, for example, with other mystics like Hildegard von Bingen, for example, that they doubt the whole idea that he was a mystic at all. The philosopher Kurt Flasch, for example, tries to present Eckhart as the first rational and modern thinker of the Western world, who had nothing to do whatsoever with mysticism or other obscure religious ideas. In fact, Flasch tries to present Eckhart as rather agnostic, if not even atheistic, thinker and philosopher, one of the first modern agnostics. I think this is totally wrong, but nevertheless, this is one of the many interpretations of Meister Eckhart. Nevertheless, this approach, like Kurt Flasch, works with a rather narrow concept of mysticism, which restricts mysticism to a model of supernatural experiences and phenomena. If we, on the other hand, instead refer to the wider concept of mysticism as a deep and intensive experience of Christian faith, our relations to Jesus Christ and God, then I believe Meister Eckhart is indeed a mystic, and as such, a guide for our own search for Christian spirituality in the 21st century. In the first point, I would like to say something about the life and the work of Meister Eckhart, and a little bit about the historical context in which he lived. And in a second point, I would like to say something about his theology and his spirituality. So in the second point, it gets more into the content. Now, first, the life and work and the historical context of Meister Eckhart. First of all, we do not know exactly where and when Meister Eckhart was born, but we assume that the year of his birth was most likely 1260. We know this because we can reconstruct his life in the order. We have some documents from his life in Paris, for example, at the university, and from this we are able to reconstruct the normal career or life of someone in the order. And if we assume that normally someone like Meister Eckhart entered the order probably around an age of 15, 16, we come roughly to the year 1260. He was born in a town called Hochheim in Thuringia in Germany. According to a later document of the University of Paris. But we don't know which one of the many Hochheims in this area. So it's not really clear which of these small villages is really the birthplace of Eckhart. Later, as a young boy, as I said, probably around 15, 16, he entered the Dominican order, the order of preachers, and he became a member of the priory in Erfurt, in Germany, in Thuringia, where he spent his first years in the order. You can still visit, if it's open, the former Dominican church in Erfurt. A very beautiful church, now a Protestant church after the Reformation, of course, and which is inside still like in the Middle Ages. So with the altar, the choir stalls and everything. So it's worth to visit. If you have ever the chance to go to Erfurt, this is definitely a place to see. In the year 1277, Eckhart studies the so-called Artes Liberales. This is kind of high school, preparation for the higher studies at a university. Higher studies are law, medicine, and of course theology. So he studies the Artes Liberales in Paris, and later, probably 1280, he might have continued his theological studies in Cologne, where he still could have met Albert the Great, one of the most important theologians and philosophers of his time, who died in November 1280. Some say he continued and finished his studies in Paris. It's not really clear, as so many dates about Eckhart, but he speaks about Albert in some of his writing as if he personally knew him. So it's probable that he indeed came to Cologne in 1280, but it's not sure. The first real document that we have of his life is an account of his sermon in Paris as lector sententiarius, the lecturer for the sentences. The sentence of Peter Lombard. This is the theological handbook of the Middle Ages, which is the basic text for theological studies. And the lector sententiarius is the first step in a career as a university teacher in theology. And so we see Eckhart in 1294 in Paris doing this job of giving comments on the sentences of Peter Lombard. This was, but after a rather short period of teaching in Paris, just 1, 2, or 2 years, he returned to his home priory in Erfurt, and he became the prior of this community. And at the same time, he was the vicar for the part of Thuringia in the German province of the Dominican order, the Teutonia. Now, I don't know how familiar you are already, after so many talks about Dominican spirituality, with the structure of the order. The Dominican order, with its head, you were in the Master General in Rome, and the structure is that it consists of various provinces, which are not always identical with countries, but nowadays most of them are. In the Middle Ages, there were not so many national states, so the Teutonia had a really a vast, huge territory. Germany, part Austria, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of Poland. I mean, it's really a huge area, which was the Teutonia in this time. And so these provinces were divided into the smaller so-called nations. So Thuringia was one nation in the province of the Teutonia, and Meister Eckhart became a vicar for this territory, for this region. What we see here is something which is characteristic for the whole life of Meister Eckhart. And this is the constant change between his theological and academic teaching on the one side, and his offices in the administration and government of the order on the other side. So he's permanently changing between these two positions, which, by the way, is also quite characteristic for the life in the order today. From this time as prior in Erfurt, we also have the first work of Eckhart, the so-called Counsels of Discernment, which is a transcript of talks which Eckhart gave to the novices and students, and maybe even for the whole community of his priory in Erfurt. It's probably the best work, by the way, of Eckhart to have a first access to the theology of Meister Eckhart, because he deals in a relatively simple language with questions of Christian spiritual life in general, and of course he's addressing novices and students in the order with monastic life in particular. The text, which had been written in German, shows Eckhart as a master of theology and of spiritual life, and even if the Counsels of Discernment are a rather early work, of course, in his life, they already show his spiritual and theological concept, which he will develop later in a more comprehensive way. And by the way, when I say he wrote, or the text is in German, it's very remarkable, because normally in the 13th, 14th century, academic people write in Latin, of course. The vernacular, the language is the language of the people, the ordinary people. But Meister Eckhart is one of the first ones who actually writes in his own language. So, and he is very, very, he is very good in inventing new words, translating terms, concepts from Latin into German. So that not only philosophers and theologians are working on Meister Eckhart, but also people who are doing research on the development of the German language. And many words he invented, he developed, are still in use in German. Like the word Bildung, which I think is not the same as education. We would probably translate it in English as education, but it's the becoming an image of something else. That's Bildung. Bild, image, and it's an active process of becoming something. An image of something else. Bildung. He invented this word, and it's still in the German language. Now, in 1302, Eckhart returned to Paris, and he is now an official professor of theology on one of the two Dominican chairs in the university. One is a chair for the French-speaking, or the French Dominicans, and the other for the foreign Dominicans, so everyone else. But this period of teaching didn't last long, because already 1 year later, in 1303, he becomes the first provincial of a new province of the order called Saxonia in Germany, which consists roughly of the northern parts of the old Teutonia. So more or less northern Germany, the northern part of Germany and the Netherlands are now part of the Saxonia. And he holds this office until 1311. And we have some documents of this time which show the administrative side of this office. After his time as provincial, he is called back to Paris for a second time of academic teaching on the chair of theology, which was a very great honor. Besides Eckhart, only Thomas Aquinas was called to Paris twice to teach there on this chair of theology. So only Thomas Aquinas and Meister Eckhart ever taught for 2 times as Magister in Sacra Theologiae in Paris of the Dominican order. In this time, he probably wrote his main theological work, the so-called Opus Tripatium, the 3-part work, which is the fruit of his academic work, but at the same time not as systematic as, for example, the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas. Nevertheless, does this work show that Eckhart is familiar with the scholastic method and the theological debates of his time. This work was lost for a long time, and it's only survived in a few copies. And another Dominican in the 19th century, he found one of these copies in a small library somewhere hidden in Germany, in Bernkastel-Kues at the Mosel. After 2 years in Paris, Eckhart was appointed by the Master General of the Order as his vicar in Strasbourg, which means that Eckhart was mainly responsible for the pastoral care of the Dominican nuns in the order in the region of southern Germany. As you know, of course, a part of the Dominican order are also the nuns, not sisters, apostolic sisters, but the nuns, contemplative sisters. And there was a huge debate about whether we should have the sisters at all. And most brothers were very reluctant to go to the sisters for, to provide pastoral care for them. But Eckhart was appointed by the Master General specifically in this region for the pastoral care for the nuns in this region. And we some of the sermons, for example, survived from this time in Strasbourg and in southern Germany. In 1322, Eckhart was appointed to be the director or the regent of the Studium Generale of the Order in Cologne. Studium generale means that it's an institution of higher studies in the order. Normally, Dominican students, they studied either in their priory or in some not so important minor studium houses of studies in their provinces. But in 1248, the order decided to have institutions of higher studies which were run by magistri, by masters in theology. So people who actually did their doctorate in Paris at the university. And in 1248. And Cologne was one of the new Studium Generale in 1248. And another one was just around the corner. It was Blackfriars in Oxford. In this time, 1322, Eckhart gets more and more involved with the spiritual movements of his time, especially with the so-called Beguines and its male equivalents, the Begards, Beguines and Begards, which is a lay movement, spiritual lay movement. Now, the time of the late 13th century and the early 14th century is a time of spiritual and political unrest in the Western European society. There's, for instance, the ongoing conflict between the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation on one side and the Pope on the other side, but also between the Pope and the King of France on the other side. France, which started to become a nation state, and the King of France wanted to control the Pope. There was this competition between both against the empire, which leads in 1309 to the move of the papal court from Rome to Avignon under Pope Clement V. Whoever been to Avignon, probably you know the palace, the papal palace. For almost a century, the popes resided in Avignon in Paris under the control of the French king. And the conflict culminated in under John the 22nd, Pope John the 22nd, the conflict with the Holy Roman Empire and its Emperor Louis IV of Bavaria, who in 1328 set up an anti-pope, Nicholas V, in Rome. He occupied Rome. He set up an anti-pope, Nicholas V. It didn't work out so well. But anyway, you can see the tensions in this time. And a result of all the conflicts between church and state was a growing discontent of many lay people with the official church and her pastoral care for the people. And there's a movement away from the official church to a more individual approach to faith, to the experience of God in our own, in my own life. And this is the time of mysticism. Mysticism as an attempt to get, as I said, deeper experiences of religion, of our relation to God. And a movement away from the official teaching of the church, the sacraments of the church, the official care of the church, and so on. An answer to this situation is a strong lay movement, like the Beguines and the Begards, but also other groups who were searching for a more intensive Christian life based on the gospel and their own mystical experience of God in their life. This development was regarded by the official church as, of course, potentially dangerous. And one way of dealing with this situation was to try to bring these groups back into the formal order of the church. For instance, through the official supervision of these groups by members of religious orders like Meister Eckhart. And that's exactly what Eckhart already did in Strasbourg. And he's continuing now with this work in Cologne. How dangerous this work could be was obvious after the burning of a French Beguine, Marguerite Porret, at the stake in Paris 1310. Eckhart tried in his sermons to transmit his theology to ordinary lay people and to sisters in the monasteries. These are the occasions where he presented most of his sermons in German, which were copied by the sisters and other people. So he didn't wrote these sermons, first of all, by himself. His audience, they copied, they wrote them down later and they copied the text. But he accepted most of these transcripts later. The fact that Eckhart is using the German language for his sermons is, of course, a way to make his theology more understandable for lay people, instead of using Latin. But this doesn't mean that he in any way tried to simplify the content of his theology. It is therefore no surprise that many in his audience misunderstood his terminology and his theological statements. It seemed in the eyes of the church that Eckhart caused more confusion than that he somehow developed a clearer understanding of the teaching of the church for the people. And so the Archbishop of Cologne, Henry of Wilneburg, accused Eckhart of heresy. That was in 1326. And he produced a list with suspicious sentences of Eckhart, and that was always the first step in an investigation by the church authorities. And Eckhart was asked to give his statement to these accusations. So they produced the list, they gave the list to Eckhart, and he should give his statement, his commentary on these sentences. And we still have this statement, this text of justification, of his own justification. We still have this text today. And then this list and the text of Eckhart was sent to Avignon, to the papal court, because as a member of the Dominican order, Eckhart was not under the authority of the Archbishop in Cologne. The authority he had to answer to was the Pope, and not the Archbishop. So he went to, and so after he solemnly declared in 1327, on the 13th of February, that in the Dominican Church in Cologne, that he might have been wrong in some points, but that he never intended to be a heretic. So he rejects all accusations that he personally, as a theologian, is in any way heretical. It might be that he erred in some points, but as a person, he refuses, he rejects this criticism, all the accusations. He travels, as I said already, to Avignon to defend his own case, and he stays at the papal court until his death 1 year later, probably at the end of January 1328. 1 year later, in 1329, Pope John the 22nd published the papal document In Agro Dominico, in which 17 sentences of Eckhart are condemned as heretical, and 11 more sentences are marked as suspicious, but with some interpretations still orthodox. Whether Eckhart himself had revoked his sentences is unknown, but it's clear that Eckhart was never personally condemned as a heretic, and also not his whole work as a theologian. Only these 17 sentences. The argument of the church against Eckhart was the fact that he presented his positions in front of lay people, and not just among theologians. If he would have presented his positions, his sentences, in a disputation among colleagues, in the Studium Generale. Fine, no problem whatsoever. The concern is to protect the faith of simple people. That's what the Archbishop wanted. This didn't work in the 14th century, and it doesn't work today, as we all know. Meister Eckhart simply refused to keep the lay people in the church uninformed and uneducated. In his book of Divine Consolations, Eckhart wrote, "And we shall be told that one ought not to talk about or write such teachings to the untaught. But to this I say that if we are not to teach people who have not been taught, no one will ever be taught, and no one will ever be able to teach or write. For that is why we teach the untaught, so that they may be changed from uninstructed into instructed. If there were nothing new, nothing would ever grow old." So Meister Eckhart. Eckhart would rather risk misunderstanding than not to try to show his listeners the way to their unity with God. That's one of his central ideas, the unity with God. The mystic John Tauler, who developed his own mystic theology within the trace of Meister Eckhart one generation later, said about Eckhart, "He spoke from the eternity, but you did understand him only in time." This is characteristic about Eckhart, that he tried to say something about that what we cannot speak about. The mystery of God, who is above all words and all images, so that we are able to go back to him and to be one with him in the ultimate unity of his being. And with this, I'm already in his own theology and spirituality, which I would call a spirituality of reason and experience. So, from my point of view, the spirituality of Eckhart is first of all a spirituality of reason. This might sound strange for someone who is looking for mystical experiences in the texts of Meister Eckhart, and who instead finds a lot of philosophy, of theological language, terminology, and so on. But Eckhart, who was always a good Dominican, believed strongly in the capability of reason to understand the mystery of faith in a certain way. Reason is for Eckhart the spiritual way to break through the matter of things towards the reality of God in our life. This God, who Eckhart is thinking about, is on the other hand not identical with the abstract God of philosophy. A God who is only a thought, an idea, is not the real God. Because in the moment we cease to think about this God ceases to exist. The God which we are only thinking or conceiving is not real. The context in which Eckhart reflects on the reality of God is always the context of Christian revelation. But reason is also the instrument with which we purify our ideas and images of God. Because God is always greater, always more, than our experiences of our wishful thinking of God, who would become a God of our own imagination, but who wouldn't be the real God of Christian faith. Eckhart's theology can be described in this sense as a negative theology, because we have to negate all our ideas and concepts about God. Only then are we free and open to receive the reality of God's being in us. The whole theology of Eckhart circles around the question how it is possible at all to say something about God, and the sometimes, you might think, paradoxical language of Eckhart is just the attempt to destroy our imaginations of God. Some people, Eckhart says in his sermon number 16, want to see their God like they look at a cow. And they want to love God like a cow. You love the cow because of the milk and cheese and your own benefits. That's how all people are who love God because of external wealth or internal consolation. Those people do not love God in an appropriate way because they only love their self-interest. So far, Meister Eckhart. By doing this, we only create our own idols, according to our own ideas and wishes. Who thinks that he knows something about God and who wants to give God a name, which means to define God with a concept, misses the real God, who is above all names and above all nature. Eckhart wants to go beyond our images, ideas or concepts about God in order to break through to the real God, the essential God, who is absolutely and radical, relevant and important for our life. A God which is not relevant for us doesn't matter. I mean, I couldn't care less about a God who might exist, but who has no connection, relation whatsoever to me, to my life, to this world. So Eckhart is looking for the essential God, der wesentliche God, the God who really matters for us. The reality itself in which we exist and of which we are a part has to be conceived as a multi-dimensional reality, which exceeds the capability of human language to comprehend the complexity of this reality. So Eckhart has a vision of our reality which is not one-dimensional, but multi-dimensional. There's more than one dimension of our reality. Nevertheless, Eckhart tries to develop new concepts which he uses to express the deeper dimension, or the depth dimension of this reality. It's this depth dimension which is, according to Eckhart, the foundation and the goal of all reality in its various other dimensions. And this foundational dimension is called unity in his theology. He describes with this term the unity of God, which is the goal of man's existence, the aim to which he should break through. This breakthrough is possible if the human being liberates himself from all distractions in this world, from all egocentrisms of his own will, in order to open himself as a space for God's unity. Only then a human being becomes aware of the fact that all being is in its deepest foundation divine. Being is in its deepest foundation divine. The question now emerges how we should understand this statement. Does this mean that every being is identical with God as an identity of being, an ontological identity, as we say in philosophy, which means that God and the creature, they fell together, they're identical, which in the end leads to a kind of a pantheism, and in its consequences probably, if everything is God, nothing is God, to a kind of an agnostic or even atheistic approach. And as I said already in the beginning, there are many philosophers, thinkers who interpret Eckhart exactly in this way. So that's why it became quite fashionable for atheistic thinkers who try to emphasize this negative side, which wants to get rid of all the concepts about God and so on. For example, Eckhart says in one of his sermons, from our, God is, even when we say God is, so he's being, he is more than this. He is being in a sense which is totally different than being as we experience being. And so we are able to say, rather than being, God is non-being. This is a paradox. And some try to interpret this as a more agnostic or even atheistic statement by Eckhart. But what he wants to say is that our idea of being, which we experience here in our existence, is not that what being is really all about. That what the fullness of being in God really is. So from our perspective, it's indeed more non-being than being, what God really is. But it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. So in this sense, you already see with examples like that of course it was possible to misunderstand Eckhart quite easily. And he didn't want to make it easy for his audience, He really wanted to present his theology, which is rather complicated, I have to admit. So, is this a possible interpretation? I don't think so. Or does divine being mean that God holds everything that exists in its being, because he is the foundation, the source of all being? Or that everything what exists is transparent for the reality of God, oriented towards God? I think this is more true than the first interpretation. Eckhart now is convinced that from the perspective of God, all creatures are a mere nothing. This sounds as if Eckhart denies any independent existence of creatures outside of God. And more than that, he seems to dissolve the existence of the creation into a pantheistic unity of reality. Eckhart now is indeed convinced that man and the whole creation, that human beings and the whole creation, are in reality one with God as a unity. This is the basic presupposition of Eckhart's theology. He conceives creatures as something which are as contingent, that means finite beings infinitely distinguished from God, and therefore creatures which lack being. Because we are so far away from God, from our perspective, that we lack being. So that from our own perspective, in our own existence, there is nothing that is able to guarantee our being itself. No one creates himself, and no one sustains himself, according to Eckhart, in this existence. We all get our being from somewhere else. We are not the source of our own being. And because of that, Eckhart is able to say we are non-beings in this sense. By the way, it's the same as with God. It's always a question of the perspective, from which we have to look at the human being here. This means that according to Eckhart, the creature is basically more a non-being than a being. This non-being of the creature is now also the reason for the powerlessness of the creature to the unity of God. From the perspective of God, the union between him and his creation remains intact. So from the perspective of God, there is a union. From the perspective of God, he is always closer to us than we are to ourselves. But from our perspective, God is far, far away. And it's the process of faith trying to get back to God. But that's from our contingent, finite human perspective, not from God's perspective. it's from our side as creatures that we have this infinite gap between us and God. To overcome this gap and really to comprehend this unity of God in the fullest sense would be the salvation of man. To return into the unity with God, this is really salvation. This is perfection of human existence. The background of this concept is the Neoplatonic philosophy of the one unity of God, which remains always the same. It's the perspective of the human being, our consciousness and subjectivity, which perceives being as changeable and pluralistic, and which insofar moves us away from the unity of being. Creation now is, according to Eckhart, something which is not divided between a creation in time, which means a kind of a big bang and that's it, and an eternal creation in God, because creation always happens in principio, that means in its origin, which is not a concept of time, but a permanent creation in God, who is the beginning and the end of creation, and in whom every creature exists in its beginning, its growing, and its fulfillment. So it's a creatio continua, it's a continuing creation. It's not, as I already said, like this more mechanistic idea, God as the watchmaker, who created the universe, universe in its structures, and then you retired somewhere, and he just let the world evolve, itself, develop itself. This is not the way Eckhart thinks. Because God is God, he is beyond time. And therefore, beginning, end, and the time between, is already in God. And we can't think about time in God. God is beyond time. Time is our own experience here on earth, but it's not time. There's no time in God. Creation is an act of God's will in the idea, the intellect, or the Son, which all can be summarized as the Logos. God, in this sense, is not just the one as pure and absolute unity, but in his creative fruitfulness, as the one who gives and sustains being. He's the source of being. He is also the Trinitarian God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Sometimes you hear Eckhart somehow denies the Trinitarian idea of God. It's really the opposite. The Trinitarian idea is very important, especially for the idea of creation in Meister Eckhart. Eckhart conceives creation in this sense as an emanation from God, which is a permanent process that can be experienced in our reality, mediated by the being of all things and creatures, which shows always its origin in God, and which is at the same time the desire and the dynamic for the movement of the whole creation back to its origin in God. So, because we only have being from God, Eckhart says we should find God in everything what is. And this is possible because everything what is, which has being, is a part of the being of God. So we are indeed able to find God in everything what is. Because everything what is from God. And only exists because it is from God. I think that's very important for his whole spirituality. Which is, it seems here at this point, as if Eckhart tries to escape from the world. But that's not really true. We have to, according to Eckhart, we have to change our perspective, our view on the world. If we let ourselves, be overwhelmed by all these worldly things, then we miss the point. If we are stuck in this world alone, and we are not interpreting the world in the right sense, then, and we think this world is all we have, then we miss the point which really matters. And this is that everything what is from God. And nothing which exists without God. This is a perspective which leads Eckhart into the world. And he's able to deal with everything what is in a new way, because he knows that everything what is from God, is in a certain way divine, because it contains this divine being. So, because there is only one being according to Eckhart, and this being is God, the creation does exist in God, who is the source of all being and our reality in which we exist. This reality is identical with the being in God. But this identity is distorted by us and our human conditions, so that the identity becomes real for us only if we overcome the plurality and temporality of our reality, as it is in our consciousness, towards the unity in its origin in God. Jesus Christ, as the Son and the incarnated Logos, remained in God, and he is therefore of one nature with God. But the creature has detached itself from its origin in God, and because there is no real being outside of God, the creature lives separated from the fullness of being in God, in the shadow of nothingness, as Eckhart describes it. Only the return into the unity with God would restore the communion with God's fullness of being. This origin in God was a perfect unity, alive with and in God without any difference and separation. Only the procession from God allows us to ask for God and his reality, because we are now separated from him and we are not able anymore to experience immediately his presence in our life. In his sermon number 52, Eckhart writes, "When I was still in my first origin, there was no God for me, and I was the origin of myself. I didn't want anything or desired anything because I was a free being and I knew myself, and I didn't want anything else. What I wanted, I was already, and I was standing there, free of God and of all things. But when I emanated from God with my free will, and I received my created being, I had a God. Because before the creatures, God wasn't God, but he was what he was. But when the creatures emerged and they received their created being, God wasn't God in himself, but God in the creatures." Now, as long as we live in this world of space and time, we are only a part of one dimension of the reality, and we are infinitely separated from God. But Eckhart is convinced that it is possible to break through this dimension to the other level of reality, on which he is able to experience this unity with God. It's now a question of a new perspective of the human being, whether he accepts the dimension of space and time as the only reality that matters, or if he really breaks through to the other dimension of the unity with God. On the first level, the human being remains separated from God, even if this distance is only, as I said, a distance for us and not for God. Eckhart is convinced that God is always close and that he would never let us alone. There's a very nice text of Eckhart where he says, you should never feel alone, because even when you are so full in yourself with all the things of the world, God can't be inside of you, because your thoughts are somewhere else. He only goes on the other side of the door, and he waits outside. So there's a picture of a very friendly God, the God who very patiently, he knows that, we have all this business and we are, stressed and whatever, and that we are not always able to think about God or whatever. And Eckhart knows that. But he's also convinced that God, who knows that, of course, more than we do, that he's just next to us. And he leaves us, in our... But he waits. He waits until we are able to open up again to receive him. So he's a very patient God. Eckhart is convinced that God is... the experience of distance from God is only our own perception of the close reality of our material world, but not the perspective of God. The purpose of the mystical theology of Eckhart now is to draw some attention to the reality of the divine dimension, because only this dimension is the real reality. That's what he's really convinced of. Only the dimension of God's reality is able to fulfill our material and temporal world with meaning and purpose. Not our world here in itself, closed in itself, is able to give meaning and purpose. Only the reality of God. But at the same time, Eckhart is far away from preaching any kind of escapism, of a denial of the world. Just contrary to this, Eckhart is eager to show the necessity of a Christian praxis in the world, based on the ethos of the gospel. Eckhart shows in his more practical advices for a spiritual life how important our acts of love for our neighbors are, and that no spiritual exercises like those which determine the life of the sisters in their monasteries are important enough when it comes to the actual work for someone who is in need. For example, he says to a sister in one of his sermons, if you are so in your ecstasy, in your prayer life, and outside, there's a poor man who needs something to eat, leave your prayer behind. Go outside, serve him some soup. So very practical here. But the spirituality of Eckhart is not only a spirituality of reason, as we said in the beginning, but also a spirituality of being. And I know I'm way too late. So I tried just to the last part. The created world as idea and its realization are mutually... No, that Eckhart is convinced that we are able to surrender ourselves to God because he totally trusts God's love and his grace for us. In this sense, he is a true Dominican, because Dominican spirituality is a spirituality based on the experience of grace and trust in God. St. Dominic was able to be free in his mission because he knew that he was carried by the grace and love of God. He was radically free because he had committed himself totally to God. Eckhart presents the same spirituality in his sermons, his writings, and especially in his life as a Dominican. Eckhart radically trusts God because he knows that we don't have to be perfect to be close to God. We don't have to be saints to return to the unity with him. The only important thing is that we really try to find God in our life, that we really want to throw ourselves into God with all our weakness and our sins. Eckhart knew that no one is so far away from God that God can't reach him anymore. And he wanted to show us how it is possible to grow more and more into this trust in God and to live our life in his love and grace. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very enlightening talk indeed. We probably could have stayed very much longer, but I know some of us have to go back to work. Thank you.
Thank you.
And please feel free to join the Eckhart Society, but certainly I'm sure there's a great deal more to his theology and philosophy and his mysticism particularly. And thank you for your ending, the encouraging ending that we are never too far, always worth approaching.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to thank you all again for coming, and I hope you enjoyed that and that you will be back again next week to hear Richard Conrad on the second part of the two